Welcome, everybody. If everyone could take their seat, we're going to get going, and I'm going to first welcome my colleague Amy Myers from across the street, director of the Yale Center for British Art, to make a few welcoming remarks. Amy?
Welcome everyone on this very wintry night. I think we all have seen enough of wintry nights, but you are intrepid and we are very delighted that you are with us for what I assure you will be a warm and stimulating evening. Jacques and I and all our colleagues are thrilled to welcome you to the opening of an extraordinary exhibition, one that explores the nature of one of the most complex philosophical, aesthetic movements in human history, and that is Romanticism, a subject, a topic, an area of human pursuit and will for understanding that still underwrites much of our own time and that deserves the interrogation that our extraordinary colleagues have given it in joining together the two magnificent collections of the Yale University Art Gallery and the Yale Center for British Art in the largest project that we've ever undertaken together. The Art Gallery, as you well know, is the oldest public museum in the United States and has been writ into the culture of the university for 2 centuries. The Yale Center for British Art across the street is a relative newcomer. It's the largest collection of British art outside the UK, the gift of Paul Mellon to the university, and augmented, of course, by magnificent gifts, just as the Yale University Art Gallery is every day. These two really rich and unparalleled university collections are world-class, and not only are their collections of such immense magnitude and importance, but also the scholars, the students who are part of the staff of both institutions enliven and enrich our understanding of their holdings in very special ways. The faculty at Yale, of course, come to study and teach in these collections in magnificent ways as well, and it brings our cultures together on a daily basis in a very stimulating and important way. That said, we have never undertaken an exhibition on the scale that the exhibition that opens tonight has been, and we owe it to a very extraordinary group of colleagues to have looked at our collections and really opened them in such extraordinary ways. We owe huge thanks to our very dear colleagues, Lisa Hodomarsky, who is the Senior Associate Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Gallery, Paolo D'Agostino, who is the Assistant Curator of European Art here at the Gallery, Cassandra Albanson, who is our Curator of Paintings and Sculpture at the Center, Nita Amstutz, who is our postdoc, working with Cassandra and very much with the team on this project, and Isabel Gass, who is our pre-doc, who is in the art history department and has been working with this team as well. Together, they have taken the complex subject of Romanticism, one that has been argued over and thought about for many, many years by scholars internationally, and have thematized it with incredible intelligence, opened up the areas of inquiry that it as a subject allows us to explore in the period, and I think you're going to find it to be just a very special experience to see the collections enlivened in the ways that they are. Our building is closed for conservation at the moment and will open in about a year's time. We are so grateful to the gallery, to our extraordinary colleagues across the street for stretching a hand across Chapel Street to allow our collections to sing in this very important way with the galleries. I should just note that Larry Cantor has installed a magnificent array of masterworks from the center in his beautiful galleries of European art to contextualize British art in a very special way. And of course, we have wonderful etchings by Whistler in the beautiful Whistler exhibition that is on view upstairs. I also would call attention to the American galleries here, which are so important to stretch across this magnificent trio of buildings, but those collections speak very beautifully to the Romanticism exhibition upstairs as well. With that said, I will turn the podium back to Jock and on with our program. Thank you, Jock.
You wouldn't all have shown up here tonight if you didn't already know who Joseph Koerner was. So I'm going to be really short on telling you that he's one of the greatest art historians of his time, one of the great faculty members at Harvard. Not only is he a great expert in the subject that you're going to hear about tonight, 6 books he's written, and much, much more, but he's someone who comes right up to the art of now. He's here tonight with his wonderful wife, Meg, and just to tell you how lucky these Harvard students are, they taught a course together on William Kentridge and took the whole seminar to South Africa for a week. So you have, and Joseph's someone very similar to our beloved John Walsh, who just spoke here so eloquently with the great series of 6 lectures on Dutch master paintings. And I have to tell you on a personal level, those of us who know Joseph and John as 2 of the stalwarts on the Yale University Art Gallery's governing board, there is nothing more pleasurable than to be in the galleries doing close looking with these 2 fantastic scholars and teachers than these 2 guys. It's an amazing experience. So he's going to deliver a fabulous talk in just a minute, but I want to digress just personally for a moment to tell you something about the Koerner family. 45 years ago, when I started as a graduate student at UC Davis, I had a fabulous professor who mentored me who was named Dan Snyder. He immediately would come over to the art department, although he was a great set designer in the drama school, and invite all of us who were training in painting, sculpture, or photography to come over and use the theaters and learn how to use them. And I finally said, well, why do you do this? And he said, well, you know, when I was a young student, I really benefited at Carnegie Mellon from the engagement with an amazing man, a professor named Henry Koerner. And he invited us not only to think about art in the broadest ways, he and his wife often had us to their home. They treated us almost like local parentists in terms of taking care of us. And I always felt that having had that experience with the Koerner family, I would give that to my students. Dan went on to be the set designer for the Berliner Ensemble, many great ballet companies, on and on. So Joseph, I don't know if I've ever told you that, but your father was known to me before I ever met you. And knowing another thing that I think is very special about Joseph coming here tonight, we just walked into the galleries together. He was class of '80, so he was able to look at some of these very paintings in the British Art Center in the last year or 2 of his undergraduate years when the British Art Center opened the building at 78. So he's deeply involved in these pictures. He'll have things to say about them that all of us will greatly enjoy. But the other thing I want you to know about him is right after Yale experienced its tercentennial, he walked into President Levin's office one day with the idea that there should be a center named for his father. And it's now the Henry Koerner Center for Emeritus Faculty. And this ties right into what I was talking about with your father. His father was such a fabulous teacher and imbued him with the value of what it is to teach well, that he wanted there to be a center at Yale where emeritus faculty who still wanted to teach could come together, have office spaces, seminar rooms, support for course development, and that great space is right on Elm Street. It was first headed by Bernie Linton and Gary Haller, who's in the audience tonight as the current director, our former great master, Jonathan Edwards. And I have to say, Joseph, that's one of the greatest gifts that's been made to this university that continues the dedication to teaching undergraduates, which you do so well. So come up and deliver this talk. We're eager to hear it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you for that very moving introduction. I never heard the story, and it's I'm really pleased to be here. It's an amazing show. I've just wandered through it, and despite what one might think a show of this diversity, it looks like an amazing unity, which is a real tribute to the curators. It's an honor for me to launch this extraordinary exhibition of romantic art. And I confess, though, that my feelings of honor are mingled with feelings of romantic terror. For how can one introduce or even make a line through such an array of objects? A fabulous duet, let's say, of Yale's distinctive collections. These objects are emphatically diverse in media, purpose, tradition, and outlook. The curators have placed the assemblage under a broad heading. Yet few historical terms are as fugitive as it. The romantic is indefinable almost by definition, even for the poets and artists who use the word to describe their work. If there's such a thing as a definitive romantic, it was perhaps the German writer Friedrich Schlegel. And when asked by his brother August Wilhelm to define the term, Friedrich Schlegel wrote, quote, "I can hardly send you my explanation of the term romantic because it would take 125 pages," end quote. Not 124 pages, mind you, not 126, but 125. And after that ironic calculation, Schlegel gives us, of course, no explanation at all. One thing that characterizes the Romantics, it is this, probably, their effort to be wholly individual in every work, and each part and each instant of every work. Romanticism is truly a wild wood, wrote Isaiah Berlin in his lecture on the movement's historical roots. It is, quote, "a labyrinth in which the only guiding thread is the will and mood of the artist." I'd like to add that to this moodiness, that Romanticism itself, perhaps, is most palpably an ineffable mood. And so to put us in that mood, I'm going to begin with a bit of music. It's the opening of a short piano piece by the German composer Felix Mendelssohn. And note that if I put an image up on the screen and it has parentheses, that means it's not in the show. All the other images are in the show. We'll hear it again. Whoop. Sorry. That's enough for now. The Yale University Art Gallery, as you've heard, runs a fabulous year-long program to train its gallery guides. Students in the program learn how not simply to impart information on their public, instead they learn to induce visitors to slow down, look closely, and say out loud what they see. So in that spirit, I'll ask you to listen closely to the piece again, this time together with the score, which also adds to our experience a shaping idea in the form of the work's poetical title, Duetto. Oops. That's not good. I think most of us heard, above all, two things, each kept movingly distinct. One voice followed by the other and playing melodically off against a second voice, as indeed sung in a duet. We also hear these two voices resounding over a dreamy backdrop played in triplets that shapes intricate melodies of its own and over a bass line that gives tonality to the voices and their accompaniment. But the pianist, here Walter Gieseking, urges us by pacing and emphasis to hear all those flowing triplets and the bass sonorities as backdrop to the two principal voices. This accords with the guideline given in the score. Note, you see it above, the two voices must be very clearly distinguished throughout. Mendelssohn added these words because just looking at the notes on the page, and without first hearing them performed by a practiced musician, a pianist might not catch, and therefore will not properly draw out in their playing the individual voices from the accompaniment, or at least not draw them out clearly and consistently as two voices. Distinguishing the voices requires the pianist to listen for them and to make them audible through subtle differences in volume and rhythm. This is hard to do because the same hands play, indeed sometimes the same hand plays, simultaneously the voice and the accompaniment. It's also difficult to do because the whole duet has to be performed solo on the piano, on the instrument that usually provides only the accompaniment to a song sung by a human voice. In an early draft of the piece, which he sent to his fiancée as a Christmas present, Mendelssohn signed the piece and titled it Duet Without Words, Duet Without Words. This heightens the challenge since it suggests that the piano must not only capture the sound of two melodies, but also the sense or meaning that voices convey to one another in a dialogue conducted in words. In its final published version, the phrase duet without words was dropped, for it became superfluous when the work appeared in an album of 6 piano pieces, all entitled Songs Without Words. Mendelssohn published 8 volumes under this evocative heading. Although the first volume issued in London bore the name Original Pieces for the Pianoforte, the German edition of that initial album was already called Lieder ohne Worte. So then, what exactly does that title mean? In 1832, when the title was launched, a German ear would have been even more attuned than we are today to the contradictory character of that sentence. At that point in the history of music, songs, Lieder, had become a pivotal genre of composition. Engaging the talent of the most ambitious composers, Lieder put the poems of contemporary writers into music while reflectively inspiring poets to engineer their poems as potential lyrics for songs. Lieder even challenged painters to visualize them without a musical accompaniment. Caspar David Friedrich's painting entitled Shepherd's Lament is based on a popular poem by Goethe of that name, and that poem would later be set to music by Franz Schubert. Schubert's Lieder represent the pinnacle of the genre, yet they point consciously back to a commonplace substratum, the humble folk song with simple poems of anonymous authorship set to tunes arising anonymously from the people, from the folk. Titling it the Shepherd's Klagelied, that's Goethe, Goethe styled his poem not as his own sophisticated creation, but as a kind of rustic lament, a naive lament. Setting the Klagelied to music, Schubert tried to preserve that natural simplicity in the elemental pairing of voice and instrumental accompaniment. Lieder were quintessential romantic expressions, not only in their content, which concerned love, yearning, and melancholy, but also in their form, which mimicked the structure of romantic love through the felt dualities of poem and melody, word and music, voice and piano. Romantic, too, was the double origin of the Lied. On the one hand, as the anonymous creation of a collectivity, the folk, on the other hand, as the hyperbolically individualized expression of a singular genius in his or her isolation, yearning impossibly to be understood and to be loved. In Songs Without Words, Mendelssohn claims to incorporate all these deep and various dualisms into the sound made by a single instrument. The composer's public, it's true, sometimes took the title to be an invitation to add words to the works. Throughout the 19th century, publishers, music journals, and individuals wrote and printed scores of these hugely popular pieces, adding poetical lyrics so that people could sing along something with the piano part. The duetto was especially inspiring in this regard. In fact, already Mendelssohn understood the two voices, the first a soprano, the second a tenor, specifically as representing a man and a woman engaged in a lover's dialogue, indeed as the composer's personal love song gifted to his beloved. This idea gives the piece a legible plot. Rather like the Yale Art Gallery and the Yale Center for British Art, the two voices meet and converse chastely, each in four measure passages. Then, about halfway through the piece, they join together in octaves, with the tenor voice giving the melody and the soprano giving into it, thereby showing how the woman, the composer's fiancée, ought to join and follow her man. I'll leave it to you to debate which is the man and which is the woman. Mendelssohn's librettist, Julius Schubring, heard the composer play duetto and grasped its plot about marital accord. Schubring also challenged Mendelssohn to write a whole series of duets, quote, for example, about that man and woman making up after a spat, or about the conversion of a vain wife by her pious husband, and so forth and so on, end quote. For many in his audience, songs without words signaled a deficit that needed to be filled, either by decoding a story in each piece or literally by supplying a text. Mendelssohn, by contrast, understood songs without words to be expressions so self-sufficient that the pianist could capture musically a voice with its instrumental accompaniment, a poem with its perfect melody, meaningful words with beautiful music. As the composer wrote to an admirer, a woman, quote, notes have just as definite a meaning as words, perhaps even more definite, end quote. And precisely because notes have that definite meaning, they are untranslatable into words. Quote, don't ask me for the key. It lies inside the piece. There's no other explanation, end quote. What we see emerging in Songs Without Words is the conflict that will bitterly divide musical culture for the next century between program music, which makes reference to an outside world, and absolute music, which refers only to itself. Mendelssohn wanted his songs to convey words wordlessly. Quote, if you ask me what I was thinking, I have to say, I was thinking of the song as it stands, end quote. Yet by calling attention to what they lack and giving some of them, like Duetto and the several Venetian gondola songs, programmatic titles, Mendelssohn asks his audience, if not to write words for them, at least to register and complete their lack. Indeed, the character of these pictures as songs consists in their communicative appeal to another person, especially the pianist. It asks to hear their words and, in hearing, to love them. Love isn't just one important topic of romantic art. It is the inner matrix of romantic art, as it asks romantically to be loved over all else. In the case of Lieder ohne Worte, that love usually began not by hearing the pieces performed, but by trying to play them oneself. This is true for romantic art generally. Romantic artists ask us not passively to receive their creations, but actively to perform and complete them. In this period in Europe, most bourgeois households possessed a piano, and at least some family members could play proficiently. As amateur skill improved, raising the bar for competence at the keyboard, composers responded with harder, flashier pieces. The difficult works, for example, of Franz Liszt were written partly in order to showcase the distinctive skills of the special prodigy or professional. By contrast, Songs Without Words were written to be playable by the practiced amateur. People heard these pieces not primarily in public concerts of the virtuosi, but privately within the domestic ritual known in German as Hausmusik. But before such modest premieres could take place at home, the first hearing of each piece took the form of its first tentative sight reading at the family piano. To sight read duetto is to hear, often only in fragments, the voices conjured unthinkingly by one's fingers, by the fingers of one hand, usually the more dexterous right hand, though sometimes by the left hand. Occasionally, to the wonderment of the mediocre pianist observing what his hands are capable of doing, the melody line is passed between the hands from the, say, forefinger and thumb of the left hand over to the thumb and forefinger of the right. Whatever hand plays it, the melody flows through the accompaniment that grows increasingly complex. Studying closely the score before beginning to play would reveal those melodies optically and intellectually, but most amateur pianists find them simply by playing and listening. That is, one does not play the voices consciously, but instead one hears them sounded as if independently of one's mind by one's fingers. But now informed by the ear, the fingers attempt to fulfill what the score demands, making each voice clear and distinct. Heuristically, through sight reading, hearing, replaying, rehearsing, and in repeated rehearsals, one discovers the song. Discovered, the song transforms the pianist into three persons, the two voices of the duet, plus the voice of the piano accompaniment itself that has to flow as if effortlessly, even though it's the most difficult part to play, particularly since one's focus has to be elsewhere on the melodies. There's no time to show this, but I invite you to listen to the whole of duetto and hear how towards the end the accompaniment transmogrifies into the melody, while the melody, the conjoined voices of soprano and tenor, fades away into a sort of memory of the melody. Not the man's voice or the woman's, but the underlying music binds the songs and is the true song without words. Robert Schumann wrote that Mendelssohn's compositions, the songs without words, like song itself, are never directed towards listeners. They are only overheard by listeners. Quote, "Who has ever not sat at the piano at twilight," and he assumes that everybody sits at the piano at twilight, "and in the midst of fantasizing on the keyboard, fantasieren, and in the midst of fantasizing on the keyboard, has not sung a faint melody along, unconsciously, unbewusst. If one happened to be able to play that sung melody with one's hands, along with the piano accompaniment, and if one happened to be Mendelssohn, then would be born the most beautiful song without words." So he's imagining that somebody would be playing, fantasizing, and then unconsciously begin to sing, and if you could do that, put into your fingers that song, and you were Mendelssohn, that is what the songs without words are. It's a typical romantic idea. Instead of hearing music, one overhears it. And one overhears it what one overhears is only a song that an artistic genius overhears himself unconsciously. And yet, despite all this indirection, or perhaps because of it, the song seems to speak urgently and directly to each of us. I want now to turn from a song without words to a painting equipped with words. First, I'll speak about the painting, then I'll speak about the words. This small picture by the British painter Frank Hull is one of the gems now on display. It comes to the show from the collection of John Walsh. For several years now, John has led the Gallery Guide program, so ideally, I would like to give the painting the sort of sustained, collective looking that he so brilliantly teaches. Following John's instructions, I would have simply asked, "What do you see?" and overheard your answers. Since this group is a bit too large to go into the gallery, and time too brief, I'll try to listen to the voices in my head. I see a girl, barefoot in rags, seated on the floor, looking at something off to the side. I see her seeing, her gaze oblique to mine, and so absorbed in seeing that there seems little chance she would break the spell and look back at me. Directed towards a spot beyond the picture's frame on the right, the girl's gaze also makes me aware that I am looking at a painting. Neither I nor you would long remain with this mere crafted thing of paint and canvas, for the virtual world its colors conjure is too visually compelling, and yet, by exiting that world, The girl's gaze keeps the painting's material limits in play. Inside those limits, I see the girl within a dark interior. Darkness at first obscures the interior, but as my eyes get accustomed to the dark, as eyes do in darkness, the room reveals clues about the girl's predicament. She lives in dire poverty, and the empty birdcage, in addition to signaling her impoverishment, conveys her entrapment in this condition as well, perhaps, as her longing for release. A black kitten slinks in past fragments of its broken bowl. Looking in our direction, the creature seems to register our presence, drawing us into the picture's plot. Its highlighted eyes intensify our experience of interior gloom, but as in Dutch genre pictures, the gloomy, derelict interior is also an excuse for the artist's demonstration of skillful brushwork and chiaroscuro. The door, the table, the battered pots, the dirty bunched-up fabrics all come punctually into focus, while also in their loose rendering in paint, they call attention to the painter's craft, which can conjure something out of nothing. Observe the effectiveness of that sliver of light behind the kitten and how visually absorbing the reds are in the rag on which the girl sits. But before I get too absorbed in the painting, let's introduce the words. In 1867, at the age of 23, Hall exhibited this canvas at the Royal Academy under the title Faces in the Fire. One critic admired how the canvas, quote, shadowed forth a story and moved to sympathy, though another critic complained that whilst the tongs at the lower right drew attention to the presence and place of the fire, Hall, quote, gave no sign of firelight on his figure. And yet the title announces that in this picture, what one doesn't see is more important than what one sees. The faces in the fire are not only concealed from us, those faces aren't in the fire either. They arise as only in the girl who, gazing into the flames, uses her imagination to see faces there. The artist sinks our projective contemplation of her face to the imaginative capabilities of the artist and to the fantasies of the girl. This shows her as yearning to be beyond her desperate social condition, which moves us to sympathy. The faces in the fire are like the words in Mendelssohn's songs. Fugitive for her and invisible to us, they are present only by their absence. Yet their absence draws us closer to the girl whose elusive facial expressions we ourselves seek to read. And their absence draws us closer to the painting, which flickers and mesmerizes like a flame. Many works on display in this exhibition insist that the viewer complete them. Until 1984, this canvas by Turner bore the title Monte Rosa. How it got this name, I do not know, since no matter how carefully one scrutinizes its distances, nothing resembling Europe's ice-capped watershed emerges from those clouds. Extended looking does, however, reveal certain landscape features that, once discovered, bring the whole into focus and give the parts an outstanding clarity. The pleasure of such discoveries, the feeling that we, working out the details, imaginatively create the image, makes this painting another perfect object for a John Walshian experiment in looking closely and saying what we see. On the left, you see not Alps, but treeless tops, treeless hills, highland hills perhaps, descending steeply to a lake. You see the reflective surface of the lake, and that further shore of which, rendered in dark blue against a lighter blue, recedes to a hidden horizon. You see the right angles of some edifice here, perhaps with ruined walls, and below it, rendered with a precision that confirms the rightness of your visual performance, water falling from a little foreground precipice into the lake or loch. A comparison with a print from Turner's Liber Studiorum identifies the view as Inverary Pier Loch Fyne Morning. There's the edifice, there's the lochside hill, there the further shore. Turner made this print in 1806 and published it in 1807 in part 7 of the Liber Studiorum. Executed in etching, aquatint, and mezzotint, it seems a decidedly finished work of art, especially compared to Yale's painting of the same scene. Yet Turner called the study on the print on the left a study. This is partly because its care and precision aims not so much at rendering the natural scene itself, but at manifesting the various pictorial devices artists might use to capture in their studies such a scene. The prints issued in the Liber Studiorum demonstrate the devices and techniques of master drawing for the purpose of study by art lovers and amateurs. Long before the Romantic period, the studies made by great artists had been passionately appreciated. Collectors believed that the sketch revealed more about an artist's skill and temperament than the finished work, because sketches thrust us more deeply into the creative process, which is more individual, more willful and moody than the final product. Romantic art took off from this notion, and it took it to a new level. Art became understood less as an intimation of nature or as an embodiment of beauty than as the expression of the individual artist. The work of art was an act of person-to-person communication, one voice speaking to us across time and space. What that voice speaks about isn't so much about the world out there as it is about the artist's subjective experience of the world. John Constable's development as a painter, at least the drama of it, consists in how, phase by phase, he learned to transfer the artistic innovations he made in his oil sketches, there's one on display, to his finished canvases, there another. The fascination rests above all in the artist's expressive means. Even Constable's cloud studies are remarkable less for what they discover about clouds than what they discover about the possibilities inherent in paint. A more theatrically public artist than Constable, Turner issued, as it were, printed facsimiles of landscape studies, while at the same time fashioning extravagantly loose sketches for his own use, like those deposited on the pages of the Channel sketchbook, amazingly kept at Yale and considered to be the last sketchbook that he kept. The eye completes these elemental marks. I see a seascape with choppy waves, perhaps, or else that feathered horizon is a distant coastal view. From his contemporary reports, and in this year's film, Mr. Turner, which I haven't seen, I have to confess, but I've seen that clip, we know how this artist turned the act of finishing a painting into a public spectacle. On Varnishing Day, when prior to the opening of an official exhibition, painters would give last touches to their works, Turner, performing before an audience who knew his routines, ostentatiously altered his work or turned a vague, sketchy canvas into a sharp landscape view. Yale's painting of Inverary Pier dates from 4 decades after Turner's printed study. It belongs to a group of 10 paintings based mainly on the Liber Studiorum subjects and left unfinished at the painter's death. It probably represents the state in which Turner took unfinished works to exhibitions before finishing them on Varnishing Day. The painter, engraver, and writer John Burnett recollects the look of these canvases on their arrival to the Royal Academy. They were, quote, divided into large masses of blue, where the water or sky was to come, and with other portions laid out in broad orange yellow, falling into delicate brown where the trees and landscapes would be placed, end quote. Finished in some parts and more a lay-in others, the Yale canvas tempts us to imagine how the artist might have completed it. Akin to Mendelssohn's Duetto, before the entrance of the melody, the painting thrusts us into the uncertainty of the creative act, where even Turner, were he alive to finish his work, would have been surprised by what resulted. since, as Schumann rightly observed of musical composition, melodies arise unconsciously, if not from the hidden recesses of a psyche, at least from physical actions not fully in an artist's control, like humming a tune or scribbling with a brush. Even on varnishing day, Turner did not exactly finish the work. Rather, he performed in the manner of a virtuoso, of a Franz Liszt of painting, the activity of finishing that still lay ahead. Once finished, Turner's works demand imaginative completion by the viewer. The sketch merely manifests what's true of the masterpiece. It indicates that the exercise of looking isn't a passive process, but a productive activity. For its original audience, and this is important, Romantic art had an even more intimate link to performance. Just as most bourgeois families boasted a piano and a pianist, in Turner's audience, most of the people in Turner's audience were trained and practiced landscape painters themselves, or many were. For a host of reasons, we today have lost many of our amateur capabilities. Few of us can sight read all the pieces in Lieder ohne Worte or make watercolors plausibly in the spirit of Turner's Liber Studiorum. Yet to appreciate Romantic art in its own terms, we must imagine what artifacts look like to someone closer to their making, not only temporally, being alive at the time, but also corporeally, being able to make something like that. The true reader, wrote Friedrich Schlegel, has to be an expanded author. Poetry can only be criticized through poetry. A judgment about art that isn't itself a work of art and that doesn't represent the impression of the work in its state of becoming has no claims to citizenship in the realm of art, end quote. The true reader is an expanded author. With music, especially before the advent of recorded sound, it's more obvious that to grasp a work's artistry, one has to perform it. Mendelssohn's Duetto is more rewarding to play, even badly, than to hear it performed. But what about the visual arts? How does one perform a painting? According to Schlegel, one does so through criticism, in German Kritik. And this brings us to the title of the exhibition, The Critique of Reason. What did the Romantics understand by critique, and what did it mean to apply critique to reason? Critique was, first of all, the intellectual buzzword of the day. Our age, wrote the philosopher Immanuel Kant in 1781, our day is the true age of critique, and to critique must everything submit, end quote. Kant made this statement in the preface to his Critique of Pure Reason. I presume the exhibition consciously echoes this famous title. The echo is appropriate, since no piece of writing more overshadowed Romantic ideas about art than Kant's critique. Even it was hard for contemporaries to understand, perhaps because it was so obscure, Kant's text dominated the imagination of the era to an extent comparable only to the French Revolution. For the German Romantics, critique as undertaken by Kant represented not only an intellectual but also a political alternative to revolution. Instead of the liberty of citizenship, the Romantics sought freedom of critique. The emancipating claims of critique long predated Kant. The word critique derives from the Greek adjective kritikos, meaning to be able to decide, separate, make judgments. The word reemerged only in the 16th and 17th centuries in the spheres of logic, philology, and aesthetics. In each of these spheres, critique carried a polemical edge against the authority of the church and the clergy. By the 18th century, critique had expanded its domain to the arenas of society and the state. Critique now functioned as the instrument of enlightenment with a capital E. The agent of critique also expanded from the erudite philosopher to the faculty of human reason itself. Kant engineered this expansion and understood its radical consequences. Right after he says that we're in the age of the critique, Kant says, quote, religion may seek to exempt itself from critique through sanctity, and law may exempt itself through its majesty, But then they, religion and law, will awaken a just suspicion and cannot claim to the sincere respect that reason gives only to what is able to sustain the best of free and open examination. In his critique, Kant reflexively turned reason on itself. Instead of beginning with fundamentals, he investigated the a prioris on which fundamentals are built. Kant didn't call his work a science, though, like the physics of Isaac Newton, which Kant venerated. Nevertheless, the reflexive turn of reason onto itself was, in Kant's view, a revolution akin to that of Copernicus. Copernicus realized that the Earth rotates on its own axis. He recognized that what had been understood to be the object of a perception, namely that the heavens revolve around the Earth, was in fact the condition of the subject of perception, the observer on a planet rotating around its own axis. Kant made an analogous turn, he felt, from the object to the subject. This powerfully impacted the theory and practice of art, again, even though people didn't quite understand what he was saying. Art now had its origins and end in itself. An expression of the artist's inner subjectivity, the artwork communicated that self to the viewer or reader or listener as their subjective experience. But one thing divided Kant from his romantic heirs. Critical readers of the Critique of Pure Reason spotted it immediately, and the title of the exhibition names it. The Romantics didn't understand the critique of reason neutrally, but took it that reason was a negative thing. They understood that reason itself had become a superstition, replacing religion and traditional authority. More troubling, reason treated everything in the same way, establishing universal rules for law, politics, and art. The Romantics, by contrast, celebrated the difference between and the ineluctable individuality of persons, cultures, and nations. What was good government, morality, and piety in one little town was bad government, morality, and piety in a neighboring little town. The plain truths of one culture were superstitions to another. This celebration of difference is most apparent in the historical epoch that Romantics chose most energetically to emulate. Starting in the Renaissance, artists imitated the achievements of classical Greece and Rome. They did this not because they appreciated antiquity's difference, though, from the present. On the contrary, they imitated the ancient past because they believed its creations were eternally binding. Forgotten during the medieval period, they dubbed the Gothic or Dark Ages as that middle period. Now antiquity had been reborn in the modern era as the proper norm for human endeavors and for art in particular. The Romantics celebrated the other era. They took the other era. They emulated Gothic art, and they did so not because they considered it a universal norm, but because it seemed to prove that there were no timeless norms, but only peculiar time-bound ones. An age of faith rather than of reason, the Middle Ages were an irrational past, the past as a critique of reason. Romanticism took its name from that era. Romanticism referred to the era of medieval romance, of a literature of chivalric love written in the vernacular or Romance languages, French, Italian, Spanish, rather than classical Latin. Romanticism also referred to the literary form of the novel, in German, the Roman. And Romanticism understood its mission as giving lived experience a storybook structure. This is roughly what another high priest of German Romanticism, Novalis, meant when he wrote, quote, "The world must be romanticized. That way one finds again its original meaning. When I confer upon the commonplace a higher meaning, upon the ordinary an enigmatic appearance, I romanticize it. The operation is reversed for the higher, unknown, mystical infinite." It's reversed as in when you see something mystical, you bring it down to earth. Romantic philosophy, lingua romana, alternating elevation and debasement, end quote. It's an amazing quote. As in a novel, everything in a romanticized world is symbolical, and everything makes sense because everything is at the service of a wondrous plot. In the imagination of the Romantics, the Middle Ages had been such a world, although back then there was no need to romanticize. The world was a wondrous roman, and that's the way it was. No one needs to seek such a world out to find again its original meaning. Now one needs to seek it. Now one needs to find again its meaning. And that makes Romanticism a quintessentially modern movement. Its sense that it's moving unknowingly into the future. Let me turn to one of the signature works on display. It's right there in the front, and observe how it romanticizes the world. Lauterbourg's canvas shows a visitor arriving to an open grave in a ruined churchyard at night. The painter signals that the visitor has just arrived and that the moment is part of his journey by showing him stepping towards the grave and by showing his garments trail after him. Perhaps because he holds a little book and marks his place with his finger, some scholars have understood the visitor to be a person of a specific type, a philosopher or poet, or even a specific philosopher-poet, namely Edward Young, whose portrait Lauterbourg painted and whose best-selling poem, Night Thoughts, this painting nicely summarizes. Whoever we take him to be, this book-reading visitor seems to have wanted to wander here, as if the ruined churchyard generally and the open grave in particular illustrated and confirmed what he reads in his book, hence his pausing here, since walking in the dead of night through graveyards isn't something one just happens to do. However, though we assume some personal intent or temperament directed him towards the grave, the painter works to orchestrate the picture's moment as a singular revelation. The visitor's agitated garments and hair suggest motion and emotion. His right hand seems about to gesture both for himself as well as us the imperative, behold. The epiphany is singular and occurs in the painter's instant. In that instant, one, the visitor arrives not just to any grave, but to a freshly opened one with the gravedigger's ladder still in place. Two, having reached the open grave, which he would have first had to glimpse and to measure, if only for his own safety, the visitor encounters among overgrown ruins a fresco of the resurrection, with Christ looking straight at the visitor, his hands pointing up and down as if in response to the visitor's downturned hand. Three, the fresco, the grave, and the visitor are spotlighted just now by a moon emerging from behind the clouds. And most emphatically, finally, the moon casts the shadow of a sundial's gnomon directly at Christ. These symbols are obvious to the questions of death, which the graveyard wanderer must have been pondering with his book. To the question of death, the risen Christ gives the answer. That these symbols are obvious isn't Lauterbourg's fault. It derives from the fact that the resurrection is standard iconography on medieval tombs. Lauterbourg's symbols are, as it were, found symbols. The graveyard wanderer finds them, and the painter captures his discovery. It's a subtle distinction, but it makes the work romantic. Lauterbourg portrays not symbols, but a subjective experience of symbols, not religion, but a fleeting personal religious feeling. The ruin rising behind the visitor are those of Tintern Abbey, that most romantic of medieval survivals. In 1756, Lauterbourg visited those ruins and sketched them from the north, capturing the exterior north transept, and off to the right, the structure of the west facade. The Yale painting shows only the ruined transept, allowing us to read the foreground grave as if it were part of the abbey's interior. The Norman tomb effigy, the Norman tomb effigy at the lower right, where the artist has cleverly placed his signature, as if chiseled into the portrait's frame, also belongs to the interior architecture of a church. We know this scenario from the works by the German Romantic painter Caspar David Friedrich, where burials, including morbidly proleptic ones of himself, take place among the ruins of a Gothic past. Here, Abbey in the Oak Forest, where he's being carried to his grave, Friedrich. Even as they dissolve into nature, those ruins preserve that past, because in the Middle Ages, as in a Gothic cathedral, everything was symbolic and everything was meaningful, or so the Romantics passionately believed. Therefore, when a romantic wanderer visits such ruins, he or she does so in order to romanticize the world and, as Novalis put it, find again the original meaning. The ruins, graveyard, and tomb situate this canvas in the aesthetics of the Gothic revival. Lauterbourg's canvas helps us appreciate how, in England already in 1790, the Middle Ages functioned as a critique of reason. Not only does the nocturnal setting counter the scenography of Enlightenment, not only do the capricious fragments of Gothic architecture challenge the norms of the classical order, but the entire graveyard plot, with its haunted corners and spooky props, is intended to elicit the emotion most contrary to reason, namely fear. Fear had been the revolutionary cornerstone of Edmund Burke's aesthetics, with its focus on the sublime as what captures and destroys us. And fear is the aim of many of the works now on display. Here, most memorably, George Stubbs's lion attacking a horse. In Lauterbourg's canvas, fear helps to characterize what religion has become in the age of reason, a powerful sentiment, but a sentiment only. On moonlit nights, nature seems at its most romantic. Illuminating the world with the reflective light of the sun, the moon renders everything more fantastical and poetical, because poets too reflect the world. In moonlight, the world itself seems moody, when in reality, moods aren't out there in the world, we know that. They exist only in the human subject. The English Romantics were especially eloquent on this matter. Again and again in his poems, William Wordsworth describes nature's vitality and immediacy, and then contrasts it to how bad he feels. Out of sync with the world, responding not to it, but to contrary impulses that arise from within, Wordsworth comes face to face with his mortality. Rising up inside us, seeping into us, pouncing on us against our will, moods force us to experience the limits of our own self-determination. Poets of the generation previous to Wordsworth explored the churchyard as a locus of fear and anxiety, not simply for macabre titillation, but via anxiety as the most powerful of moods. They did so to bring subjectivity itself into focus. Not death, graveyards, or even religion is the subject of Lauterbourg's romantic art, but subjectivity itself as we observe the visitor in an epiphany of his own existence. It's a small step from here to Caspar David Friedrich's halted travelers, always turned away from us to the landscape before them. Through these figures, the world the painter sets before us becomes something not seen, but something overseen, in a moment long past, in an individual subjectivity unavailable to us because facing away from us. I began to write about art, all art, in a class at Yale looking at Friedrich's Wanderer. What struck me so long ago, and what still moves me now, is how this artist makes the entire expansive mountain landscape seem to emanate from the wanderer's heart. This is Romanticism at its most extravagant, the self as creator of the phenomenal world. I learned about this claim from the great critics who were my teachers here. Harold Bloom, Jeffrey Hartman, and Paul Dumont explored the dark side of this claim, how self-consciousness, what Shelley called the spirit of solipsism, and William Blake called the genuine Satan, how self-consciousness was a dangerous yearning for death. Thanks to my teachers, I zeroed in on what Friedrich's paintings hide, namely the wanderer's face, which causes the expanding world to retreat into the concealment of someone else's experience. Whereas Friedrich focuses everything on that single subjectivity, other Romantic artists make this focus by subtler means. Wanderers play no great role in Constable. The figures in his landscape belong to the land. Their unreflective labor seems to mirror the artist's, who turns his eye as if neutrally towards this imperfect view. No natural coulisses frame this view. It jumps erratically from near to far, and its foreground boasts nothing but clods of mud. From his biography, we know that Constable painted the things he deeply and personally loved. Here, the vista from his window, from the window of his childhood home in East Bergholt. We don't need to know where the kitchen garden is or what it meant to the painter to sense its special focus. Sheer ordinariness, coupled with a supreme conviction, signals that for its maker, this view meant everything. In his reminiscence of the English Romantic poets, Henry Crabb Robinson recounts a conversation he had had with Blake about a line from Wordsworth. The line is famous. It comes from the Intimation Ode. The line goes as follows: "But there's a tree of many one, a single field which I have looked upon. Both of them speak of something that is gone. But there's a tree of many one, a single field which I have looked upon. Both of them speak of something that is gone." Robinson read these words to Blake, and he reports that they, quote, threw him into almost hysterical rapture, end quote. Why this happened, Robinson does not say. Indeed, he reports then that when he read Wordsworth's odes to his other friends, he omitted those lines, quote, "lest I should be rendered ridiculous, being unable to explain precisely what I admired." It is the singular that moved Wordsworth. This tree and no other, this field and no other. What the tree and field looks like and why they move him, he doesn't say, because he can't say their singularity, just as the grounds for sympathy with those lines are also unsayable, and even saying them causes embarrassment. Robinson's fear of seeming ridiculous is the embarrassment of an unexplained personal response. I think out of a similar fear, Mendelssohn refused to explain his songs without words. Either you get them or you don't. In the composer's words, all else is, quote, a lie. This can put the artist, needless to say, into a difficult bind, because with no public meaning, the music, the poem, the painting risks having no public. If the artist is a singular genius, as the Romantics liked to claim, the artist can expect to be misunderstood in his own time. One work in the exhibition encapsulates beautifully this predicament. This remarkable large self-portrait drawing dates from the early 1770s, from the very beginning of the era we've been exploring. Its maker is now presumed to be the British painter by the name of James Jeffreys. He turns his back to us, inviting us to look over his shoulder at what he has written and appears to be reading. "Honored Sir, I flatter myself I have abilities for the art," There we go. "I flatter myself I have abilities for the art of painting, which I hope will appear by the drawing I send you. But indeed there are so many young persons pursuing the same art that I think it will be a prudent step to drop it entirely and give into any kind of business you shall think proper. I make no doubt but you will comply with my desire, more especially when you inform yourself how much the profession is disgraced by the folly and vice of many of the professors." Jefferson probably addressed these words and the image that contains them to his patron and godfather, John Benchley. He sought to prove his artistry through his self-portrait, perhaps by means of its evidently calligraphic flair, particularly in the hair, but certainly through its originality, For I know of no artist's likeness before this where the sitter hides his face. Jeffries made a pendant drawing of himself looking out at us as he works on a sketch. Note that his left hand is pretending to be his right hand, because it's very difficult to capture one's active sketching hand. I would love to dwell on this double self-portrait, which encapsulates the artist's elusiveness to himself, how it is only the artist who can't see himself both front and back. That's the artist's predicament. You think the artist knows himself better than anyone else, but artists realize that they're the one person in the world that can't see their own back. But speaking of back to the Yale drawing. In it, the gesture of turning away is meant not to complete the portrait, but to mime something contained in the text. The question of being misunderstood or ignored by the foolish profession. So it's a kind of amateur drawing, or a question of whether the amateur drawer can become a professional. So you're at that edge, like the amateur pianist of Liszt, or like someone looking at a Turner in the Liber Studiorum. Am I an artist? At the lower center of the sheet, the artist has penned the words rara avis in terra. The artist is a singularity, a, quote, rare bird on earth, end quote. Since you won't understand me, the self-portrait defensively declares, I'll show my back to you. But as with Friedrich's figures, the turned self-portrait invites us to look over its shoulder, enter its subjectivity, and see the world as he does, in its hermetically specific way. It's up to you, dear viewer, to hear my wordless song and understand its words. I've tried rather feebly to put some words to some of the pictures on display. I invite you all now to do so yourself. Thank you for your attention.
Joseph said he would be glad to take a number of questions, maybe for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a wonderful reception for him and all of you out in our lobby. So those of you, there's a microphone in the back and one that can be passed around. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'll put something nice to look at least on.
How and when did you ever figure this out?
I don't know what I figured out, but certainly I've always been fascinated by Friedrich, and I also really enjoyed playing Mendelssohn's Duetto, and I enjoyed, because I really didn't know which one it was, and I was just playing, and all of a sudden I heard the melody. I didn't read that you're supposed to hear the melody. And it's incredibly hard to bring out the melody for a bad pianist like myself. And so I was thinking, what kind of, first of all, what kind of experience is that? That kind of participatory experience, and then how much, it was a kind of trivial point in the sense of it makes so much sense, but how much when we look at romantic art or art before 1900, we can't put ourselves into the position of makers, even if we're amateur makers. And that after recorded sound and after people basically leave behind their talents, usually in grade school or high school, how everything comes to us and we are very passive about it. And I think to understand Romanticism, just at some basic level, you need to look at Turner like you want to paint like Turner, that sort of thing. But at a deeper level, that's all that Romanticism was somewhat about. Although I also think that Romanticism is about the beginning of the sense that that isn't the case anymore. That people, and that's in a way the Jeffries self-portrait, that already there's these professors, and there's this way that you can't just be an ordinary person painting. Now, there was no time when ordinary people painted like that, but the Romantics are just at that edge where everybody thinks that they can be a genius, Everyone from every little town in Germany thought they could write like Goethe. And of course, they were incredibly disappointed because there was no opportunity for everybody. I mean, it was impossible. So you have this whole literature on disappointment. And anyway, so I think that's kind of where it came from, a mixture of typical academic and very old and actually founded in Yale understanding of what Romanticism is, with something more to do with just actually getting into either painting or playing piano in this case.
Do people ever call you the fourth dimension?
No. No, but they did do some good, the fifth dimension did do some good disco.
You said you studied with Demas.
Uh-huh.
And of course, a contemporary
Yeah.
contemporary audience hears the emphasis on difference
Right.
in the Romantics, and we immediately think of Derrida and all.
Right.
Do you, I mean, maybe this is outside the realm of the discussion, but do you regard the Derrida and Deman as failed romantics, as frustrated romantics?
I would say that every romantic is frustrated,
Right.
and therefore they're authentic romantics. And they're authentic romantics, I think, in the sense that Schlegel said that Romanticism is really fulfills itself in criticism. That a certain strand of Romanticism to which I think they powerfully belonged and that formed me very much was the idea that criticism wasn't a philosophy. Wasn't just, in fact, it wasn't philosophy. Schlegel wasn't a philosopher. It wasn't philosophy. It wasn't Kant. You're not doing big systems and figuring out metaphysics. It's not philosophy. But it is also not a matter of judging works of art. It's not a matter of whether the work of art is good or bad. And it's also not just about kind of pedagogical ways of drawing a poem or a text apart for the sake of teaching just what the poem is about. There's something active about it. And in fact, it completes the work. That's how they understand it. And I saw that group of people at that moment as very much in tune with that, not as a whole. I mean, and again, I don't think, one of the things that they made at least me and I think my generation feel, who was influenced by them, is that actually you don't have to be a philosopher to understand them. So my understanding of them isn't as a professional. I don't know that Derrida all that well, and Paul Deman gets very, very complicated. But something about what it means to write about art and what it means to respond to art, and how that isn't just either subjective appreciation, but has a kind of clarity and dignity. And I think that they were really influential to that. And there were a lot of other very specific things that the Yale critics were, for me, very important, like the motif of the halted traveler in Jeffrey Hartman, which was understood as a whole way that just the condition of a poem. What is a poem? Anyway, so I would say that I would understand that movement, not about failed romantics, but the resurgence of Romanticism and the creation of an alternative way of doing what's used to be sort of a philosophical endeavor outside of the philosophy departments. And that's what was appealing, for better or for worse, as an undergraduate. I didn't go to the philosophy department, and there was just many positions, and they occupied a particular one. But I'm getting maybe a little too specialized there.
Thank you so much, Professor Koerner, for your talk. I was really struck throughout by this motif of doublings from the duetto. I've worked on a project on Brock's Le Duo, so this was very resonant for me. Mm-hmm. But the duetto to the double self-portrait to the pairing of reason and its critique.
Right.
And I wonder if you may speak a bit about this motif of the double. This comes out of the post-structuralist question. In terms of the relationship of Romanticism to classicism, and this came out of a discussion I had with Stephen Schur on the way over here, who's one of the lenders. Is classicism always the sort of second melody in Romanticism, and how do you conceive of that relationship? And thinking back also to medieval art, which is one of the things you emphasized out of the medieval relate itself to the classical?
Right, right. Yeah, I have to confess, I find of all the kind of chestnuts of the question of Romanticism, the one that I have never quite gotten my understanding around is the classical romantic distinction. But I do think that classicism, maybe this doesn't answer the question that you're talking about dualism, but classicism, being actually mainly a person who works in the Renaissance, it had always fascinated me that Romanticism chose this other era, which it doesn't even say that it's the Middle Ages, but romance and vernacular language and love, it's all a kind of almost a deliberate fantasy of this past. That the past that they recuperated, and they recuperated it, at least in Germany, almost on the day that Napoleon was crowned emperor in Rome, as a sort of nightmare of German sensibility. They recuperated a past that wasn't exemplary, that was kind of other, and they kept it as other. Whereas, and that I think stands in a certain tension with, even though the rebirth of antiquity is always filled with senses of distance and separation, there's not that almost perverse decision to take a grotesque past and recuperate it, a past that even in its look, the sort of fragment, the wild fragment, not the fragment like the torso. If the classical ideal is the classical torso, which you can imaginatively complete, in the romantic Gothic ruin, you almost don't want it to be complete. It's a picture of a completely erratic past. How that funnels into ideas about dualism is, I think, quite complicated. But I think there, when I go back to the kind of Yale school understanding of Romanticism as fundamentally about placing in endless series of plots the relationship between the mind and the world. And for me, the more mundane of the plots, the more easy it is to understand. So if the plot, and then about duets, for me the plot is most easy to understand in some of the songs of German Romanticism. So like Schubert's Winterreise, where the duality is between the voice and the piano, but the piano plays the natural world out there, and the voice is the human subject. But it's also between himself and his lover. The lead as a song form was understood always as a dialogue between the self and between the man and the woman. But then in Schubert, there's no woman, so et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of multiplication of dualities is something that is very compelling. But I don't like then to philosophize it too much and think about monisms versus dualism. That seems to me hard. I can't get my head around that.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions, okay?
Yes, I loved your paper. I haven't heard anything as subtle and mind-bending as that for a long time. Can you hear me?
Thank you.
Yes? No?
There we go.
Yes.
Now we're here.
Well, I started with a compliment, okay?
Thank you.
2 quite different comments, I guess. I was driving down from Boston to come to your talk, and I listened to a lot of country music, which seems to me to be, in a way, the contemporary version of Romanticism, summed up by the phrase that caught my ear today, sorrow on the rocks, which doesn't, of course, mean a sad person standing on the rocks. It means a person in a bar.
Oh.
Which may perhaps serve as a transition to what's going to happen
It's a
next.
transition to our going upstairs.
But I just want to ask you more seriously. The two versions of the scene that you showed us from Turner
Yes,
are so extremely different
yes.
that it almost made me feel that the latter one was not romanticism at all.
Right.
But it was Turner saying, I'm done with romanticism. I'm moving on to something actually more complex, which we would call modernism, but he would not. But he's moving towards a dissolution of the image
Right, right,
in a philosophical sense.
right.
And I
Understand
once
that.
heard a wonderful, perhaps I read a wonderful paper about the elderly sublime, or worse still, the senile sublime, a state into which artists pass, which allows them to break all the rules that they themselves have constructed.
Sort of late style, yeah.
And
Yeah. I would say two things that are really great from that question. Thank you. I think one thing is that with Romanticism, there's always not only a temptation, but a lot of evidence to see it as very cliched, as a movement towards kitsch, a movement towards a set of fashionable, identifiable topoi, graves, windblown hair, blah, blah, blah. And then there's another view of Romanticism that is basically makes it synonymous with modernity, that we still are romantics, that everything that is Romanticism back then, fundamentally we haven't changed from that position. And it's an idea that actually was very much present in the Yale School of Literary Criticism. You understood Romanticism, you could understand ourselves. And it's also somewhat true of Isaiah Berlin's rather different understanding, which has to do with understanding Romanticism as the big change, like St. Augustine, then there's Romanticism. And there it has more to do with politics and with an irrationality of politics, which, anyway, you have these two views of Romanticism, either very localized in a few years, and then the localization gets shorter and shorter until it's like 3 years in Germany, and then it ends. But I would say that, that when one gets down to that, let's say, core Romanticism of Schlegel, despite all the so-called varieties of Romanticism, what you're describing of Turner really does fit exactly the description, which is that Romanticism, in both its highest definition, but even in what it's trying to explain by saying romance, what is that? A novelization of experience. That there was always the sense that it'll be always in the future. That Romanticism isn't whatever the artist is doing in the present. It's always project. It's never completion. That's the reason why Romantics loved to write in the forms of fragments and imagine giant projects and then write like 3 lines. So I see the Turner drawings as philosophically in line with that movement towards Romanticism. And just one little footnote, probably the most theoretically complex romantic as a painter was a German artist who isn't so well known named Philipp Otto Runge. And in Runge you have this amazing brief biographical moment in which he's painting allegories, very typical allegories they're actually literal allegories, like the allegory of the day, allegory of the seasons, allegories of plants. And he says, I'm just doing this because I have to teach the viewers, the public, a symbolism in order for me to get beyond any symbol and paint pure painting. And he actually paints abstractions. So Runge already around 1803 not only is doing gestural abstraction, but more or less Malevich-like abstraction of getting rid of the subject matter, but somewhat on a theoretical basis. So he's both, and you can see that on the one hand, Runge is totally cliched when you sometimes, because it's all these rococo allegories. On the other hand, it moves ahead. So the temporal structure of Romanticism, the fact that it's simultaneously kitschy allegory and yearns to be something that we'll never know what it is. We're still living it, we might say. We're still in that future that Romanticism projects, I think is the essence. It's why it's so hard to grasp, but why I think grasping it is so exciting and important to do.